The land held no mercy. It was a canvas of cracked earth and brittle sagebrush, stretched taut under a sun that bleached the color from the sky itself. In the distance, the flat-topped mesas shimmered, their edges blurring in the heat until they looked like solid waves on a sea of baked dirt. The wind was the only thing that moved with any purpose, a dry, persistent whisper that carried the scent of dust and the faint, clean perfume of pine from mountains that were a day's hard ride away. Silas felt the sun on the back of his neck, a familiar, heavy weight. He rode a buckskin gelding, a sturdy, sensible animal that matched his own temperament. The horse moved with a steady, ground-eating gait, its hooves kicking up small puffs of ochre dust that hung in the still air. Silas sat tall in the saddle, a man in his late 20s whose face was already a map of long days and hard miles. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. He was not looking for a fight, or for fortune, or for anything that required a man to announce himself. He was looking for a place to disappear. He rode toward the faint smudge on the horizon that suggested a town, a place to buy flour and coffee, and perhaps find a few weeks of work before moving on. That was the rhythm he had set for himself. Ride, work, ride again. The movement was a balm, and the hard labor exhausted his body enough to quiet his mind. Most nights, it worked. But in the quiet hours, or in the hypnotic space of a long day's ride, the ghosts always found him. A flicker of orange against the dark wood of a barn wall. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass. He blinked, the sweat stinging his eyes. The scent of wood smoke, thick and acrid, filled his senses, so real he could almost taste the ash on his tongue. Then came the sound, the one that tore through the fabric of his sleep and haunted his waking hours. A woman's scream, high and thin. Cut short, he squeezed his eyes shut, his hands tightening on the leather reins. He had failed. He had stood there, helpless, and he had failed to protect them. The knowledge was a brand on his soul, a self-imposed sentence of lonely wandering. His life was now an act of penance, a duty to atone for a sin he could never undo. He looked up again, his jaw set. The town was closer now. A crudely painted sign read Redemption Gulch. Silas let out a short, bitter breath. Redemption. The word was a mockery, a cruel joke played by whatever god ruled this harsh and empty land. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a wound on the landscape. A single wide street, ankle-deep in dust, was flanked by a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings that seemed to be holding on against the elements by sheer stubbornness. There was a saloon with swinging doors, a livery, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the rhythmic clang of a hammer, and a handful of other structures, including a general store. The air was thick with the smells of horse manure, wood smoke, and something else, a tension that was almost a physical presence. The few people on the boardwalks moved with a purpose that bordered on grim. Their faces were hardened, their eyes narrowed against the glare and against each other. They were survivors, not neighbors. Silas swung down from his buckskin, tying the reins to a hitching post outside the general store. He needed supplies, and he wanted to get the feel of the place. He pushed through the door, the small bell above it giving a tinny, cheerless jingle. The interior was dim, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. A portly man with a graying mustache stood behind the counter, weighing out flour for a tall, gaunt rancher. Two women stood near the fabric bolts, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. And then he saw her. She was standing by the counter, waiting. She held a small, nearly empty cloth sack in her hands. There was a quiet dignity about her, from the straight line of her back to the simple way her dark hair was pinned up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. She was not beautiful in the way of saloon girls. With painted faces and easy smiles, her beauty was in the fine structure of her bones, the steady set of her jaw, and the deep, clear brown of her eyes. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended more than once, but it was clean and neat. The storekeeper finished with the rancher, who paid and left without a word. The man then turned his attention to the two whispering women, asking what they needed. He served them with a forced politeness, laughing at a small joke one of them made. All the while, the woman with the dark hair waited, her gaze fixed on a point just past the man's shoulder. She did not fidget or sigh. She simply stood, a small island of stillness in the room. When the two women had gathered their things and moved away, still whispering and casting sharp, sideways glances at her, the storekeeper finally turned to her. His face, which had been arranged in a mask of professional courtesy, went flat and hard. "What do you want, Ilara?" he asked, his voice curt. "Flour, Mr. Abernathy, and salt, just a little of each." Her voice was low and steady, without a trace of pleading. He scooped the flour into her sack with grudging, jerky movements, spilling a little on the counter. He did not bother to wipe it up. He weighed it, took her few coins without meeting her eyes, and pushed the sack toward her. She murmured a quiet "thank you," her expression unreadable, and turned to leave. As she passed Silas, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He saw it then. What her proud posture and calm face were meant to hide, it was a flicker of deep, profound hurt, a vulnerability so raw it was like looking at an open wound. It was there, and then it was gone, masked by a veil of stoic composure. But he had seen it, and in that moment, he felt a pull, a protective instinct that was as unwelcome as it was powerful. Her loneliness was a tangible thing, a cloak she wore that was as real as her faded dress. It was a loneliness he recognized, for he wore one just like it. Silas bought his supplies and left the suffocating judgment of the town behind. He had no intention of finding work in a place like that. He rode out of Redemption Gulch and followed the valley as it widened, the sparse grass growing a little thicker. He was looking for a place on the edges, away from the watchful, wary eyes. He found it a few miles later, a small, independent ranch nestled against a low rise of hills. A sign, its letters faded by the sun, Reedstone Ranch. It was a struggling operation. He could see that at a glance. The main barn needed a new roof, and the fences, while sturdy, were old and patched in places. It was a place overshadowed by a larger, more prosperous power, the kind of place that would be the first to get squeezed when times got tough. An old man with a cloud of white hair and a back bent by years of labor was sitting on the porch of the main cabin, mending a bridle. He looked up as Silas approached, his eyes pale blue and surprisingly sharp, taking in the stranger and his horse in a single, practiced sweep. "Looking for something?" the old man asked, his voice raspy. "Work," Silas said simply. The man grunted, his eyes lingering on the way Silas sat his horse, the easy confidence in his posture. "Can you mend a fence? Can you brand a calf without burning it to Sunday? Can you ride for 10 hours and not complain about it?" "I can," Silas said. The old man stood, wincing as his joints protested. "Name's Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." Silas. He offered no surname, and Jed did not ask for one. Jed walked a slow circle around the buckskin, running a gnarled hand along its flank. "Good horse, strong legs. You take care of him." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Jed had seen enough men to know that the way a man treated his horse said a lot about the man himself. He looked back at Silas, his gaze direct. He saw the weariness in the younger man's eyes, but he also saw a core of solid honesty, a quiet capability that a man could trust. In this valley, that was a rare commodity. "Not much I can offer," Jed said, his voice softening slightly. "The big fish in this pond, Thaddeus Blackwood, he likes to make things hard for the little ones. Pay is meager. Bunkhouse ain't much more than a roof, but the food's decent, and the work is honest." "That's all I am looking for," Silas replied. "All right then, Silas," Jed said with a decisive nod. "You can put your horse in the corral. "Bunkhouse is over there. Supper's at sundown." Silas accepted. He was grateful for the work. But more than that, he was grateful for the distance. Here, with only the wind and the cattle and the old man for company, maybe the ghosts would grow quiet. Maybe here, he could find a measure of peace. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. The work was grueling, a relentless battle against an environment that gave nothing easily. Silas spent his days under a vast, empty sky. The sun a hammer that beat down on him from dawn till dusk. He mended fences, his hands growing raw from handling the wire and digging post holes in the rocky soil. He rode for miles, pushing Jed's small herd of cattle through arid terrain, searching for patches of sparse grass. Every day was a fight against the constant threat of drought, against the coyotes that stalked the edges of the herd, and against the silent, encroaching pressure of Thaddeus Blackwood's massive operation, whose fences seemed to move a little closer every season. The landscape was both an adversary and a sanctuary. It was a harsh master, demanding constant vigilance and resilience. A moment's carelessness could mean a lame horse, a lost calf, or a broken bone. But it was also a place of profound, stark beauty. In the evenings, Silas would watch the sun set, painting the western sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the light catching the tops of the mesas and setting them on fire. At night, the sky was a blanket of black velvet so dark and clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. A river of diamonds spilled across the heavens. Silas found a grim comfort in the physical toll of the work. The ache in his back, the burn in his muscles. These were clean pains, honest and simple. They drove out the more complicated aches in his soul. When he finally fell into his bunk at night, his body so spent it felt weighted with lead. His mind was too tired to conjure the images of fire and the echoes of a scream. The exhaustion was a form of prayer, a nightly baptism that washed his mind clean, if only for a few hours. From the high ridges where he rode the fence lines, he could see her place. Ilara's homestead was a small patch of defiant green in the brown landscape. Situated not far from Jed's ranch, it was a small cabin with a stone chimney, a fenced-in garden, and a chicken coop, all nestled in a gentle fold of the land. The property's real value, Silas knew, was the small, life-giving creek that ran through it, a silver thread in the dry valley. He never rode close, but he watched her as he worked. He saw her in the early mornings, a solitary figure tending to her garden, her hands in the earth. He saw her on the roof of her cabin one afternoon, hammering new shingles into place with sure, steady strokes. He saw her stand on her porch with a rifle, its stock held firmly against her shoulder, and drop a coyote that had gotten too bold, too close to her chickens. He saw a woman who worked from sunup to sundown, a woman who was entirely, fiercely alone. He pieced her story together from quiet conversations with Jed. The old man spoke of it with a deep sadness. Ilara had been married to a man named Thomas. The town, Jed said, never gave him a chance. Some said he was a half-breed, his mother a Cheyenne woman. Others whispered he was an outlaw, though no one could name a crime he had committed. The truth, Jed believed, was that Thomas was simply a free spirit who knew the land better than any man in the valley and refused to bend his knee to anyone, especially not to Thaddeus Blackwood. A year ago, Thomas had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine. They called it a hunting accident, a fall. Jed spat on the ground when he said the words. Thomas knew those hills like the lines on his own hand. He was more sure-footed than a mountain goat. It was no accident. Since then, the town had treated Ilara like a plague, led by the whispers and rumors spread by Blackwood's men. They had branded her as tainted, the widow of an undesirable. But Silas, watching her from the lonely ridges, did not see a pariah. He saw a survivor, a woman whose quiet strength was a thing of beauty, as stark and powerful as the land itself. The storm came without warning. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the air grew thick and still. Then the heavens opened up. It was a classic Western deluge, a furious downpour that turned the dusty gullies into raging, muddy torrents. The rain fell in solid sheets, blurring the world into a gray chaos of wind and water. Silas was out checking on a group of heifers, making sure they did not get swept away. The rain plastered his shirt to his skin and ran in rivulets from the brim of his hat. As he rode the boundary line he shared with Alara's property, he saw that a section of her fence had been washed away. Worse, a massive old cottonwood tree, its roots loosened by the flood, had toppled directly into the breach. He found her there, in the heart of the storm. She was soaked through, her dress clinging to her, her hair a dark, tangled mess. Mud was streaked across her face and arms. She was struggling to move a heavy branch of the fallen tree, her slight frame straining against the immense weight. She was shivering, but her jaw was set in a line of pure, unyielding determination. Silas dismounted without a word. He walked over to the log she was fighting with and put his shoulder next to hers. She startled, her head jerking up, her brown eyes wide. She looked at him, rain dripping from her chin, a question in her expression. He just nodded and pushed. Together. Their combined strength was enough. The log groaned and shifted. They worked in the pouring rain. A silent, efficient team. He used his rope and his horse, the well-trained buckskin pulling true, to drag the larger sections of the trunk clear of the fence line. When the breach was finally clear, they stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the rain sluicing down around them. "The wire is snapped," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "My calf could get out." "I've got wire and tools in my saddlebag," he replied, his own voice low and rough. "We can mend it." He worked while she held the fence posts steady. Their conversation was minimal, consisting only of the practicalities of the task. "Pull it tighter. Hold it there." But the shared effort in the heart of the tempest created a powerful, unspoken connection. In a world that had isolated them both, they were, for this brief time, allies against the indifferent fury of nature. As he was twisting the final piece of wire tight, he noticed the fine trembling of her hands. It was not just from the cold, he realized, but from utter exhaustion. He finished the job and turned to her. He untied the oilcloth coat from the back of his saddle. It was dry on the inside. "Here," he said, holding it out. She shook her head, her pride a visible thing. "I'm all right." "You are shaking," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Take it." She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then, with a quiet, grateful nod, she took the coat and slipped her arms into it. It was far too big for her, but it was warm. She pulled it tight around herself, and, for the first time, some of the rigid determination in her posture seemed to soften. Days later, Silas was riding that same fence line, this time under a clear, hot sky. As he passed her homestead, he saw that the handle of her water pump was hanging limp and useless. He saw the wooden bucket sitting by her porch and knew what it meant. She was hauling water from the creek, a back-breaking, soul-crushing task that never ended. He stopped his horse. He could ride on. It was not his concern. But the image of her, soaked and shivering but refusing to give up, was still fresh in his mind. Under the guise of checking the fence again, he dismounted and tied his horse to one of the posts. He pulled a small tool roll from his saddlebags and walked toward her cabin. Ilara appeared on the porch as he approached, her expression a mixture of suspicion and surprise. She stood with her arms crossed, watching him, a silent question in her eyes. She had learned long ago not to trust the kindness of men. It was always a transaction, a prelude to a demand. He did not ask for permission. He simply knelt beside the pump and began to work. His movements were economical and sure. He had grown up on a farm, and the inner workings of a simple machine like this were as familiar to him as the feel of his own horse. He worked for over an hour in the hot sun, taking the mechanism apart, finding the worn leather gasket that had failed, and crafting a new one from a spare piece he carried. Ilara watched him the entire time. She did not speak, but her silence was attentive. She saw the quiet competence in his hands, the focused intent on his face. This was not the act of a man looking for a reward. It was the act of a man who saw something broken and knew how to fix it. When he was finished, he reassembled the pump and worked the handle. It moved smoothly, and after a few moments, a stream of cool, clear water gushed from the spout. He stood up, wiping the grease from his hands on a rag. Ilara came down from the porch, carrying a tin cup. She held it under the spout, filled it, and offered it to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He took the cup. It was the first water drawn from the newly repaired pump. He drank it down, the water a blessing against the heat of the day. Their eyes met over the rim of the cup, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken things. He saw gratitude in her gaze, but also a hesitant curiosity. She saw a quiet strength in his, a steadiness she had not encountered in a long, long time. In that shared glance, a small crack appeared in the thick wall he had built around his heart, and in her, a tiny glimmer of hope, an emotion she thought had died with her husband, flickered faintly to life. That evening, as the sun began its fiery descent, Silas was helping Jed herd a few stray cattle back toward the main pasture. As they crested a small hill, Jed pulled his horse to a stop, his body tense. "What is it?" Silas asked. Jed pointed with his chin toward the ground. "Tracks, and they are not ours." Silas dismounted, kneeling to examine the churned-up earth. A half-dozen cattle had been driven through here, pushed hard and fast. The hoofprints of several shod horses were mixed in. He followed the tracks for 100 yards. They led north, toward the vast, open territory that belonged to Thaddeus Blackwood. "Rustled," Jed said, his voice grim. "It is a clear message." Silas stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he could see the faint lights of Blackwood's main ranch house, a sprawling complex that dominated the valley. Jed's voice was low, filled with a weary resignation. "That's how he does it. Squeezes a man, a few cattle here, a dammed upstream there. He makes it so hard to survive that you have no choice but to sell out to him for pennies on the dollar. That is how he swallowed up the Miller place and the Hanson Ranch." Silas's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his gaze shifted from the distant lights of Blackwood's empire to a different point in the darkening landscape. He looked in the direction of Ilara's small, lonely cabin. A single point of light against the encroaching shadows. The protective instinct he had felt in town, the connection he had felt in the storm, now solidified into something else. It became a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in his gut. He knew then that his search for a place to disappear was over. The trouble he had spent a year trying to outrun had found him once again, and the lonely woman with the resilient eyes was standing right in its path. The rustling left a sour taste in the air, a grim quiet that settled over Jed's ranch like a shroud. The old man was jumpy, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, but Silas moved with a new, deliberate calm. The waiting was the worst part of any fight, and Silas knew, with a certainty that settled cold and hard in his gut, that a fight was coming. He did not have to wait long. 3 days after they found the tracks, 5 riders crested the hill overlooking the ranch. They were led by a man on a magnificent black stallion, a man whose size and bearing made the 4 hired guns behind him seem like mere shadows. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a clean hat, an affront to the dust and grime of the valley. This was Thaddeus Blackwood. He radiated an aura of arrogant entitlement, as if the very land he rode upon belonged to him by divine right. They stopped just outside the main corral, not bothering to dismount. Jed came out onto the porch, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped them on his trousers. Silas emerged from the barn, moving into the open space between the porch and the riders. He stopped, his posture relaxed, his hand hanging naturally at his side, never more than a few inches from the worn walnut grip of his colt. Stone! Blackwood's voice boomed, a rich baritone accustomed to being obeyed. Just paying a neighborly visit. This is the first neighborly visit you have paid in 10 years. Blackwood, Jed said, his voice raspy but holding firm. A slow, predatory smile spread across Blackwood's face. The valley is getting crowded. A man has to keep track of his boundaries. I have noticed some of my cattle seem to have a taste for the grass on this side of the ridge. And some of yours, he paused, letting the implication hang in the air, seem to wander a bit far from home. A man with a small herd should be extra careful about keeping his stock accounted for. Strays can be a nuisance. It was not an accusation, but a threat wrapped in the language of ranching. Silas remained perfectly still, his gaze locked on Blackwood. The cattle baron's eyes slid from Jed to Silas, and they narrowed slightly. He took in Silas's calm demeanor, the competent way he stood his ground, the lack of fear in his eyes. Blackwood was a man who understood power, and he recognized that the quiet man before him was not some common drifter Jed had hired for a month's wages. He saw a potential problem. "And who is this?" Blackwood asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "New help?" "His name is Silas," Jed said. "He works for me." Blackwood's eyes lingered on Silas for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out across the dusty yard. Silas did not flinch. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze steady and unyielding. Finally, Blackwood let out a short, dismissive laugh. He had made his point. He had shown his power. "See that you keep your fences mended. Stone," he said, pulling lightly on his reins, with a final, contemptuous smirk. He turned his horse and, followed by his men, rode away. Jed let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He looked pale and shaken. "He is a devil, that one." Silas watched the riders disappear over the ridge. "He is just a man. Jed—" "Some men are worse than devils," the old man whispered. But as he looked at Silas's quiet, resolute strength, he felt a small, unfamiliar sliver of courage return to his weary heart. A few days later, Silas was repairing a stretch of fence near Ilara's property when he saw one of her calves, a skittish little thing, slip through a weak spot in her own fence and bolt toward the open range. He saw Ilara come out of her cabin, a rope in hand, her face a mask of frustration. A lone woman trying to round up a spooked calf in this terrain was a long, hard job. He mounted his buckskin and rode over. "Looks like you could use another hand," he said as he approached. She looked up, surprised. She hesitated, her ingrained self-reliance making her want to refuse. But the sight of the calf disappearing into a thicket of scrub oak made her nod. "It keeps getting through that same spot. I would be grateful." They worked together for the better part of an hour. He was a skilled horseman, and his buckskin was well trained, cutting off the calf's attempts to flee while she moved in on foot to rope it. As they guided the tired animal back to her small corral, a tentative conversation began between them. "He belonged to my husband, Thomas," she said, stroking the calf's neck. "The last of the herd he bought before—" Her voice trailed off. Silas gave her the space to continue if she wished. He busied himself tightening the latch on the corral gate. "The people in town," she began, her voice low. "They have their own stories about him. They call him an outlaw, but he was not. He was a good man, a gentleman." She looked at Silas, her eyes searching his face, gauging if he was a man who would listen or a man who would judge. His mother was Cheyenne. That was his only crime. In their eyes, that, and the fact that he would not bow to Thaddeus Blackwood. She spoke of Thomas with a love that was still achingly alive. She described a man who could read the land like a book, who knew the secret ways of the animals and the changing moods of the seasons. Blackwood had wanted that knowledge. He had offered to hire Thomas as a scout, but Thomas had refused to work for a man who choked the life out of the valley. His independence had been a threat. "He died a year ago," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she stared out at the hills where it had happened. "They said he was hunting. that he fell into the ravine up on Blackwood's northern range. The sheriff ruled it an accident. She turned to face Silas fully, and he saw the raw, unhealed wound of her grief in her eyes. But it was no accident. Silas, Thomas was raised in these hills. He was too sure-footed, and he was found on a piece of land with the only year-round spring in that entire section. Land Blackwood had been trying to get from him for years. The unspoken word hung between them in the still air. Murder. Silas now understood the full depth of her isolation. She was not just a widow. She was the widow of a man the town despised, a man she believed had been murdered by the most powerful figure in the valley. She was living alone with a terrible truth that no one would acknowledge, a truth that had branded her and left her utterly alone. The following week, Ilara's supplies ran low. There was no avoiding a trip into Redemption Gulch. Silas, seeing her load her small wagon that morning, felt a familiar knot of unease tighten in his stomach. He found a reason to go to town himself, telling Jed he needed to pick up some harness rivets from the blacksmith. He arrived a little after she did, tying his horse across the street from the general store. He watched as she went inside. A few minutes later, 3 of Blackwood's men stumbled out of the saloon. They were loud, drunk, and full of the swagger that came from working for a man who owned the town. They saw Ilara's wagon and decided to wait. When she came out of the store, a sack of flour in her arms, they blocked her path. "Well, look here," one of them sneered, a big man with a slack jaw and cruel eyes. "It is the outlaw's widow. Come to spend some of that stolen money your husband left you?" "Leave me be, Frank," she said, her voice steady, though Silas could see the color drain from her face. "Why the hurry?" another one chimed in, stepping closer. "We just want to be friendly. A pretty woman like you must get awful lonely out on that little patch of dirt all by herself." The man's suggestion was ugly and clear. The few townsfolk on the street stopped to watch. Some shuffled their feet and looked away, their faces showing a flicker of pity. But no one moved to help. Most just stared with a cold indifference, or worse, a silent approval. This was the town's justice, the slow, cruel punishment of a woman who had dared to exist outside their accepted norms. Ilara stood her ground, her back straight, her chin up. "I have no business with you," she said, her expression defiant. Frank reached out a grimy hand to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell over the group. Silas had crossed the street. He did not run or shout. He simply walked into the middle of them, his presence so sudden and silent that it was more startling than a gunshot. He radiated a quiet lethality, a sense of coiled stillness that promised swift and terrible violence. He did not look at Ilara. His cold, gray eyes were fixed on the 3 men. "Move along," he said. His voice was low, almost conversational, but it cut through the drunken haze like a razor. The men hesitated. They were 3 to his 1, but they saw something in his eyes, a complete lack of fear, a chilling certainty that sobered them instantly. They were bullies, not fighters, and they knew they were standing in front of a man who would not hesitate to kill them where they stood. Frank slowly lowered his hand. After a tense, silent moment, the men grumbled and shuffled away, casting hateful glances over their shoulders. Silas turned to Ilara. "Let me help you with that," he said, taking the heavy sack of flour from her as if it weighed nothing. The walk to her wagon was short, but the silence was thick with the weight of his actions. He had not just saved her from a moment of unpleasantness. He had publicly drawn a line in the dust of Redemption Gulch. He had placed himself on her side, against the town, and against Thaddeus Blackwood, and everyone had seen it. As a thank you, Ilara insisted that he come to her cabin for dinner that evening. It was not a casual invitation, and he knew it. It was a significant gesture of trust, an acknowledgement of the stand he had taken for her. Her cabin was small, with only 2 rooms, but it was a testament to her spirit. The wooden floors were scrubbed clean, and a vase on the simple plank table held a spray of purple wildflowers. A colorful, hand-stitched quilt was folded neatly on the edge of her bed. It was a sparse home, but it was filled with a sense of warmth and resilience. The meal was simple, a rich beef stew with potatoes and carrots from her garden, and a loaf of fresh, crusty bread. To Silas and Alara, two people who had grown accustomed to eating alone, it felt like a feast. In the warm, golden glow of the oil lamp, the harshness of the outside world seemed to recede, held at bay by the cabin's sturdy walls. They talked more freely than they ever had before. She asked him about his life before he came to the valley. Uncharacteristically, Silas found himself speaking of it. He did not talk about the fire or the screams. He talked about the good things, the memories he kept buried under the layers of his grief. He spoke of the farm he had grown up on in Ohio, of the rich black earth and the smell of it after a spring rain. He told her about his father, a quiet man who had taught him how to read the patterns of the clouds and the turn of the seasons. She, in turn, told him about her dreams with Thomas. They had planned to build 2 more rooms onto the cabin, to buy more cattle, to raise a family in this valley that Thomas had loved so much. They had dreamed of a simple, peaceful life, a life that seemed forever out of reach for both of them now. As they talked, they discovered a shared longing, a deep-seated desire for a peace they had both lost. It was not an evening of romance. It was something quieter, and perhaps deeper. It was a rare and precious moment of genuine human connection, a brief respite for 2 lonely souls who had found, in each other's company, a temporary sanctuary from the world. Blackwood's next move was as cruel as it was brilliant. The small creek that ran through Alara's land was the lifeblood of her homestead. It watered her garden and her animals. It was also a key water source for the southern part of the valley. One morning, Alara awoke to find the creek had slowed to a muddy trickle. Silas rode upstream to investigate. Just inside the border of Blackwood's property, he found the cause. Blackwood's men had constructed a crude but effective dam of rock and timber, diverting the bulk of the water into a new channel that led toward their own pastures. It was a slow, deliberate act of war, designed to choke her off her land without firing a single shot. Within days, the effects were devastating. The leaves on her tomato plants began to curl and yellow. The earth in her garden cracked. Her few animals stood listlessly by the nearly dry creek bed. Silas watched her from a distance, saw the growing desperation in her posture as she hauled bucket after bucket of the remaining murky water to her most precious plants. He saw her distress, and a cold anger settled in his heart. He knew there was no point in going to the sheriff. The law in Redemption Gulch wore Thaddeus Blackwood's brand. That night, he spoke to Jed. "I am going to handle it," he said, his voice flat and hard. Jed looked at him, his old eyes full of worry. "Be careful, son. Blackwood does not forgive a challenge." "I am not asking for his forgiveness," Silas replied. Under the cover of a moonless, star-dusted sky, Silas rode upstream. He moved like a ghost through the familiar landscape, the sound of his horse's hooves muffled by the soft earth. The air was cool and smelled of sage. He tethered his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and approached the dam on foot. It was a crude barrier, but strong. He worked for hours in the darkness, the only sounds the scrape of rock on rock and his own strained breathing, using a long, sturdy branch as a lever and all of his physical strength. He painstakingly loosened and rolled away the largest stones at the base of the dam. It was grueling, dangerous work. Finally, with a great sucking sound, a section of the barrier gave way. The water, held back for days, surged through the opening, a triumphant, gurgling roar in the night silence. He had not destroyed the dam, but he had breached it, restoring the life-giving flow to Alara's creek. He knew this direct challenge would bring severe repercussions, but as he watched the water run free, he felt no fear, only a grim satisfaction. He returned to his bunkhouse just as the first pale light of dawn was staining the eastern sky. He was exhausted. His hands were cut and bleeding, and his shirt was torn. As he swung down from his horse, a figure stepped out from the deep shadows of the barn. It was Alara. She had been waiting for him. She had seen him ride out, and in her heart, she had known where he was going. She had spent the entire night pacing her small cabin, her mind a torment of worry. Seeing him now, safe but bearing the clear marks of his dangerous work, the immense relief that washed over her broke down the carefully constructed walls of her self-preservation. She saw the cuts on his hands, the deep weariness in his face, and she understood the immense risk he had taken. For her, she stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of him. She raised a hand, her touch as gentle as a moth's wing, and brushed a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "You should not have," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I had to," he replied, his voice low and rough. In that moment, everything changed. The tension of the past weeks, the shared danger, the unspoken feelings that had been growing between them, it all ignited at once. The world narrowed to the small space between them. He looked down into her eyes, and he saw his own loneliness, his own fear, and his own profound, aching need reflected there. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was hungry and desperate, a collision of two souls starved for comfort. It was a kiss born of shared hardship and the terrifying knowledge that the world was trying to tear them apart. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and dust and solace, a defiant claim on life in the face of so much death. It was an acknowledgement that their only sanctuary was in each other. For a few days after the dam was breached, an eerie quiet settled over the valley. The water flowed freely in Alara's creek, and her garden began to revive. Blackwood did not immediately retaliate, and that silence unnerved Silas more than an open attack would have. A patient predator was the most dangerous kind. He and Alara spent more time together, stealing moments by the creek or meeting in the twilight hours after their work was done. Their physical desire for each other was now a palpable force, a constant, humming undercurrent to every shared glance and quiet conversation. But they held back, a silent, mutual understanding passing between them. To give in to that desire completely would be to make themselves even more vulnerable, to give Blackwood another weapon to use against them. One evening, they sat together on a flat rock overlooking her small homestead, watching the sun go down. The sky was painted in violent streaks of red and orange, a sky that was too beautiful to be peaceful. It was a perfect reflection of the beauty and the danger that now defined their lives. They had won a small battle, but Silas knew, with a chilling certainty, that Blackwood was merely biding his time. His revenge, when it came, would be devastating. The quiet lasted for 5 days, 5 days of clear skies, a steady flowing creek, and a fragile peace that felt more like a held breath than a true calm. On the night of the 6th day, the breath was brutally let out. Silas was jerked from a shallow sleep by a sound that lived in his deepest nightmares, a hungry, devouring roar. He was out of his bunk before he was fully awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning hay and pine. Outside, the night was no longer dark, but a terrifying, flickering orange. Jed's main barn was an inferno, flames leaping from the roof and licking at the stars, a monstrous blossom of destruction in the heart of the night. "Silas!" Jed's frantic shout cut through the roar. Silas ran, pulling on his boots as he went. The heat was a physical blow, pushing him back. Inside the barn, he could hear the high, terrified screaming of horses. He and Jed met by the main doors, the old man's face a ghostly white in the firelight. "The horses!" Jed cried, his voice cracking with anguish. There was no time for a plan. They plunged into the smoke-filled barn, the heat scorching their lungs. It was a hell of swirling ash, collapsing timbers, and the panicked, wide-eyed terror of trapped animals. They worked with a desperate, focused fury, unlatching stalls, cutting ropes, slapping and shoving the terrified horses out into the relative safety of the corral. They managed to free most of them, their frantic work a chaotic dance with death. But the fire was too fast, too greedy. The hayloft collapsed in a shower of embers, sending a wall of flame across the back of the barn. A sound of pure agony, the shriek of a horse, was cut short. It was Apollo, Jed's prized breeding stallion, the pride of his small ranch. "No!" Jed started to move toward the flames, but Silas grabbed his arm, hauling him back just as the main roof beam gave way with a deafening groan. The entire structure imploded, collapsing into a mountain of fire and black smoke, sending a mushroom cloud of sparks into the night sky. They stood there, panting and scorched, watching the fire consume the heart of Jed's livelihood. There was no proof, no sign of who had done it, but they both knew. This was not a stray spark or an overturned lantern. This was Blackwood's reply. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed not to kill, but to cripple, to burn away an old man's hope, and to show Silas that anything he tried to protect would turn to ash. The fire broke Jed Stone. In the gray, smoky light of dawn, he looked like a man who had aged 20 years overnight. His spirit, a tough, resilient thing that had weathered decades of drought and hardship, seemed to have been consumed by the flames. He walked through the smoldering ruins of his barn, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of hollow despair. The financial loss was absolute. A year's worth of hay, a lifetime's collection of tools, and the future of his herd, all gone. 2 days later, one of Blackwood's men rode into the yard. He was not a hired gun, but a clerkish man with soft hands and a sympathetic smile that did not reach his eyes. He came with an offer from Blackwood to buy the ranch. It was a paltry sum, an insult, but the man framed it as a generous act of assistance for a neighbor in a time of trouble. Jed was tempted. Silas could see it in the way the old man's eyes lost their focus, in the way he kept staring out at the blackened timbers of the barn. He was old and tired, and the thought of giving up, of simply walking away from the pain, was a powerful lure. That evening, they had a tense, emotional conversation by the dim light of a lantern in the main cabin. "Maybe I should take it." "Silas," Jed said, his voice barely a whisper, "I am too old to start again from this. Too old to fight him." "If you sell, he wins," Silas said, his voice tight. "That is what he wants. He wants to burn you out, then act like he is your savior." Jed looked up, and for the first time, Silas saw not just despair, but a flicker of resentment in the old man's eyes. "And what am I supposed to do? This trouble, all this real trouble, it did not start till you showed up. Son, first my cattle, now my barn. You poked the bear, and now it is my home that is burning down." The words struck Silas like a physical blow. They were the exact echo of the accusations he had been leveling against himself for years. He was a harbinger of disaster, a magnet for tragedy. He brought ruin to good people. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of his past failures settle upon him, and he had no defense against it. He could only stand there, his jaw clenched, and take the verbal lashing. He thought the old man was lost to him, to the fear. But Jedediah Stone was made of sterner stuff than even he knew. The next morning, after a long night of sitting alone with his conscience, Jed's inherent decency won out. When Blackwood's man returned for an answer, the old man met him on the porch. "You can go back and tell Thaddeus Blackwood," Jed said, his voice clear and steady, "to take his generous offer and his feigned concern and get off my property. This ranch is not for sale." Later, Jed found Silas by the corral. "I was wrong to say what I said," the old man admitted, his gaze direct. "This is not your fault. It is Blackwood's, and I will not be chased off my own land by that tyrant." The act of defiance seemed to have rekindled a small flame in the old man's spirit. It was a decision that might well seal his fate, but it was his own, and in making it, he reaffirmed the bond between the two men. The escalating danger pushed Silas and Alara closer together, making their stolen moments of peace all the more precious. The world was shrinking around them, becoming a landscape of threats and shadows, and they found their only sanctuary in each other. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky. Silas found Alara sitting by the creek. Her rifle was laid across her lap, and her eyes were scanning the darkening hillsides. She was not relaxing. She was on watch. He sat down beside her on the cool earth. For a while, they said nothing, simply listening to the gentle murmur of the water. "I am afraid," she finally confessed, her voice so low he could barely hear it. "Not for myself. I am used to being alone, used to being hated. I am afraid for you. Silas, after the fire at Jed's, everyone knows it was retaliation for the dam. You are a marked man now. Blackwood will not stop." He looked at her, at the genuine terror for his safety in her eyes, and the wall he kept so carefully guarded around his own heart crumbled just a little more. "I am afraid too," he admitted, the words tasting strange and foreign on his tongue. "My fear is that my being here will destroy you, that I will bring Blackwood's wrath down on your head, just for being near me." He paused, the silence stretching as he wrestled with ghosts he had never allowed into the light. "It has happened before. I bring ruin to people I care for." She turned to him, her expression soft and questioning, inviting him to say more. And for the first time since he had ridden away from the smoldering ruins of his own life, he spoke the truth of it. "I was not a soldier," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was not an outlaw. I was a farmer. I had a wife, Sarah, and a little girl, Molly." Just saying their names was an agony, a reopening of a wound that had never healed. "We had a small farm, good land, but we had a powerful neighbor, a man like Blackwood, who believed everything he could see should belong to him. We had a dispute over a spring that bordered our properties." He stared out at the dark water of the creek, but he was seeing a different time, a different place. "He and his men came for us in the night. I fought back. I did, but there were too many of them. They held me and made me watch as they set fire to our home." His voice broke, and a single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "I heard them scream, Sarah, and my little girl. I heard them, and I could do nothing. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed." The confession hung in the air between them, agonizing and raw. He had finally given voice to the failure that had defined his every waking moment since. Ilara's heart broke for him. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time. His quiet strength, his weary eyes, his carefully controlled stillness. It was all a shield, a fortress built around an almost unbearable amount of pain and guilt. She did not feel pity for him. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion. What she felt was a deep, fierce empathy that resonated in her own soul. She knew what it was to lose everything, to be left alone with the ghosts of what might have been. She reached for him, her hand covering his. He flinched and tried to pull away, to retreat back into the solitary prison of his grief. "You should stay away from me, Ilara," he said, his voice choked. "Do not you see? I bring nothing but ruin." She held on tighter, her fingers lacing with his, refusing to let him go. "That fire was not your fault, Silas," she said, her voice full of a conviction he had never allowed himself to feel. "You fought for them. The fault lies with the evil men who lit the match." She moved closer, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her gaze was steady and strong. "Your past is not your fault, and your present. You are the only good thing that has happened to me in a long, long time." They were in her small, lamp-lit cabin. He had followed her back from the creek, and now the world outside was a threatening darkness, a wilderness of potential violence. But inside, in the golden circle of light, the emotional dam that both of them had so carefully constructed finally broke. The crushing loneliness, the constant fear, the bottomless grief, and the intense, simmering desire that had been an undercurrent between them for weeks, it all overflowed. She looked at him, her beautiful, strong face softened by a desperate love. "I can't resist you anymore," she whispered. The words were not a statement of simple passion. They were a surrender to a feeling that was both terrifying in its intensity and the only thing that felt real and true in their broken lives. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not like the first one, which had been born of desperation and relief. This was a kiss of profound understanding, of shared sorrow and a defiant hope. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the small bed. Their coming together was not merely a physical act. It was a collision of two wounded souls finding a desperate, healing sanctuary in one another. It was a tender, aching, and silent conversation, a defiant gesture of life and love in a world that seemed determined to crush them with death and hate. In the days that followed, there was a palpable shift between them. Their love, now an undeniable fact, became a source of strength that made them feel, however fleetingly, that they could face anything. They began to speak of a future, their words careful and hesitant, circling around the ideas of maybe and someday. They dreamed aloud of leaving the valley, of finding a place in the green hills of Oregon, a place where their pasts could not find them, where their names were not burdened with tragedy. Silas worked with a renewed purpose, helping Jed begin the slow, arduous process of clearing the rubble and planning to rebuild the barn. For the first time in years, he allowed a flicker of hope to warm the cold, guarded corners of his heart. He had something to fight for again, a future to build. The narrative of their days was written in small, intimate moments. Silas, his hand steady over hers, teaching her a better way to sight her rifle. Ilara, her head bent in the lamplight, mending a tear in his shirt. The two of them, sitting together in a comfortable silence on her porch after a long day's work, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge one by one in the vast, dark sky. But Thaddeus Blackwood was not a man to be ignored. Infuriated by their continued defiance, by Jed's refusal to sell, by the simple fact that they had dared to find happiness in his valley, he decided to eliminate the problem permanently. He knew Silas was dangerous, not a man to be faced directly in a fair fight. So he chose his moment with a predator's cunning. He waited for a day when Silas rode out to the far western pasture to repair a long stretch of fence, a full day's work that would keep him away until dusk. Then, Blackwood and three of his most trusted, ruthless men rode to Jed's ranch. The attack was brutal and swift. Jed, old and outmatched, stood no chance. It was not a clean death. Blackwood made an example of him, a bloody and savage message to anyone who might still harbor thoughts of defiance. Silas rode home at dusk, a strange sense of unease having shadowed him all afternoon. He saw the smoke first, a thin, gray plume rising into the twilight sky. It was not the thick, black smoke of a full-blown fire, but the wispy smoke of something that had already burned. He spurred his horse, his heart pounding with a sickening, familiar dread. He found the smoldering remains of the bunkhouse and Jed's small cabin. They had not been worth the effort to burn to the ground, merely set alight as a final, contemptuous gesture. And then he found Jed. The old man's body was lying in the dust near the porch of his ruined home. The scene was one of stark, deliberate brutality, designed to terrorize and to punish. For Silas, it was a devastating, soul-shattering echo of his past. The pattern had repeated itself. The one good man who had trusted him, who had shown him kindness, was dead. And he was dead because of Silas. The brief, beautiful hope he had allowed himself to feel was brutally extinguished, replaced by a grief and a rage so profound it was almost paralyzing. He fell to his knees in the dust and the ash, the scent of smoke filling his lungs. A silent, raw scream was trapped in his throat, a sound of utter agony that had no escape. He was utterly broken, alone in the twilight with the body of his friend, surrounded by the ruins of a life he had failed, once again, to protect. The fragile glimmer of hope had been swallowed by an overwhelming, all-consuming darkness. The silence that followed Jed's death was a living thing. It filled the valley, heavier and more profound than any sound. Silas moved through this silence like a ghost, his body a machine performing the necessary tasks while his soul was somewhere far away, lost in a landscape of ash and memory. He dug the grave himself, on a small, wind-swept hill that overlooked the ruined ranch. The work was an agonizing ritual, each shovelful of rocky earth a penance. He wrapped the old man in his best blanket and lowered him gently into the ground. He fashioned a simple wooden cross and stood before it as the sun went down, a solitary mourner in a world that had been emptied of kindness. For several days, he did not leave the ranch. He barely ate. Sleep was a torment, a gateway to a recurring nightmare of fire and screams, Jed's face blurring with the half-remembered faces of his wife and daughter. He was consumed by a dark, brooding vortex of self-loathing. He was a curse, a walking plague that brought destruction to anyone foolish enough to offer him shelter or trust. He had sought a place to disappear, but instead, he had brought his own personal hell to a good man's doorstep. He avoided Alara. When he saw her approaching the ranch with a basket of food, he would retreat into the scorched ruins of the barn, hiding from her concern as if it were an accusation. He could not bear to look at her, for fear of seeing the same fate reflected in her eyes. But Alara refused to let him push her away. On the third day, she came not with food, but with a quiet determination. She found him sitting on the ground by Jed's grave, his back against a weathered rock, staring out at nothing. He looked hollowed out, a man whittled down to nothing but grief and guilt. She did not speak. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort that would have sounded like lies in the face of such a brutal truth. She simply sat down a few feet away from him, her back also against the rock, and shared his silence. Her presence was not an intrusion. It was an anchor. She sat with him as the sun arced across the sky, a steady, unwavering testament that he was not, despite what his soul was telling him, entirely alone. Hours passed. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple. It was her quiet, persistent solidarity that finally broke through the thick walls of his despair. He turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since he had found Jed's body. His eyes were not the eyes she knew. The weariness was gone, burned away. In its place was a terrifying coldness, a chilling clarity like the surface of a frozen lake. The grief was still there, but it had been forged into something harder, sharper. It had become a weapon. "He will not win," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was the first time he had spoken in days. "I will not run anymore." He stood, his movements stiff but full of a new, terrible purpose. He was no longer just a survivor, haunted by the past. He was an instrument of justice. "I am going to destroy him. Alara, I am going to burn Thaddeus Blackwood's world to the ground." Silas knew he could not take on Blackwood's empire alone. Vengeance was a fire in his gut, but it was a fire that needed to be wielded with strategy, not just rage. He began to ride, not away from the valley, but deeper into it. He moved discreetly, visiting the other small ranchers who lived under Blackwood's shadow. At first, they were terrified. They were men and women who had been bullied, cheated, and intimidated for years. Jed's murder had been a clear and brutal message, and they wanted no part of the trouble that had brought it about. The door of the first rancher he visited, a man named Peterson, was shut firmly in his face. But Silas was patient and determined. He did not make grand speeches about honor or justice. He spoke to them plainly, one-on-one, in their barns and on their porches. He appealed not to their heroism, but to their basic, stubborn instinct for survival. He killed Jed because Jed stood up to him, Silas told a grizzled old farmer named Henry Gable, whose land bordered Blackwoods on the east. "He took my cattle and your water rights last spring. He will not stop with Jed. He will keep pushing, keep squeezing, until he has swallowed every last one of you, one by one. You can wait for your turn, or you can fight back." His own quiet resolve, coupled with the stark reality of what had happened to their neighbor, began to wear down their fear. A few began to listen. The first to agree were Caleb and Ben Miller, a pair of tough, determined brothers in their 20s whose father had been one of the ranchers Blackwood had squeezed out years before. They harbored a deep-seated hatred for the man. Then Henry Gable, the old farmer, spat on the ground and said he was tired of living on his knees. It was a small, fragile alliance, two young men burning for revenge, an old man who had found his last bit of courage, and Silas, the ghost who had decided to fight back. But it was a start. Ilara became the quiet, strategic heart of their resistance. She was more than Silas's lover, more than his emotional anchor. She was a keen observer, and her years of being an outcast had made her invisible to the men in town. She had overheard conversations in the general store, seen the patterns of Blackwood's operations, and noticed things others had missed. Her simple cabin kitchen became their war room. By the light of a flickering oil lamp, they would spread out a crude, hand-drawn map of the valley. "His supply wagons come through Hangman's Pass every 2 weeks," she would say, her finger tracing a line on the map. "They are heaviest on the return trip, loaded with goods from the railhead, and they are only ever guarded by 2 men. She knew the routines of Blackwood's hired guns, where they watered their horses, which pastures were the least watched. Her knowledge, combined with Silas's tactical mind and the Miller brothers' familiarity with the land, transformed their desperate anger into a workable plan. Their collaboration deepened their bond, forging it from a desperate romance into a true partnership. Their fight for survival was now a shared mission. They began their campaign of strategic disruption, operating from the shadows like ghosts. They did not engage in open battle. They were a fly stinging a bull. One night, using firecrackers and waving blankets, they started a cattle stampede at the edge of Blackwood's vast herd, scattering over 100 head of prime beef into the rocky, inaccessible Badlands. It would take Blackwood's men weeks to round them all up, if they ever could. A week later, under the cover of a storm, Silas and Caleb Miller sawed halfway through the main support beams of a key bridge on the trail to the railhead. The next supply wagon that tried to cross it collapsed the structure, sending a month's worth of expensive supplies into the rushing creek below and forcing all of Blackwood's traffic on a long, arduous detour that cost him time and money. They used their intimate knowledge of the land to outmaneuver Blackwood's patrols, melting into the canyons and thickets they had known since they were boys. Each small victory was a morale boost for the small band of ranchers and a frustrating, infuriating thorn in Blackwood's side. The narrative in the valley began to shift, from one of absolute fear to one of whispered rumor and a spark of defiance. Thaddeus Blackwood was enraged. These were not the actions of common rustlers. They were targeted, intelligent attacks. He could not pinpoint who was responsible, and the uncertainty made him grow increasingly paranoid. He began to distrust his own men, seeing incompetence and betrayal in every corner. His brutal grip on the town of Redemption Gulch tightened. He offered a substantial bounty for any information about the saboteurs, turning neighbor against neighbor and sowing seeds of fear and suspicion. The corrupt sheriff, a man named Cobb who was fully in Blackwood's pocket, began harassing anyone even suspected of sympathizing with the small ranchers, dragging them in for questioning and intimidation. The risks of their campaign were ever present. During one of their most daring operations, an attempt to destroy a wagon filled with a shipment of new repeating rifles for Blackwood's men, things went wrong. They had been given a tip about the wagon's route, but the tip was a trap. They were ambushed. In the chaotic exchange of gunfire in the dark, Ben Miller cried out, clutching his leg. Blackwood's men were closing in. Without hesitation, Silas orchestrated a daring retreat. "Get him out of here!" he yelled to Caleb, firing his own pistol to draw the attention of their attackers. He gave his friends the precious seconds they needed to pull the wounded Ben onto a horse and disappear into the darkness. He followed moments later, a ghost slipping through a hail of bullets. He returned to Ilara's cabin hours later. Just before dawn, she was waiting, as he knew she would be. He stumbled through her door, a dark slash of blood soaking the side of his shirt. A bullet had grazed him along his ribs. The scene that followed was incredibly intimate, as she gently cleaned the wound with a cloth and hot water. Her hands were steady, but her face was taut with a fear that she could not hide. The sting of the whiskey she used as an antiseptic was nothing compared to the look in her eyes. In that moment, they both confronted the sharp, terrifying reality that he could be killed at any moment, that every ride into the night could be his last. The physical pain was a dull ache compared to the emotional agony of their potential separation. That night, their lovemaking was different. The desperate passion was still there, but it was tempered with a profound, aching tenderness. It was less a joining of bodies, and more a desperate need to affirm life in the ever-present shadow of death. They clung to each other in the darkness of her small cabin, whispering promises and fears. Their fragile, defiant existence, a single flickering candle against a vast and encroaching storm. Ben Miller needed a doctor. The bullet was still in his leg, and the wound was festering. Leaving him would be a death sentence. Silas made a decision that put all of them at risk. Under the cover of the deepest darkness, he and Caleb loaded the feverish Ben into the back of a wagon, covered him with canvas, and took him into Redemption Gulch. They went to the home of Dr. Adams, a man who had lived in the town for 30 years. He had long disliked Blackwood's tyrannical rule, but, like most, had been too afraid to act. Silas and Caleb carried Ben into his surgery and laid him on the table. "You know what will happen to you if Blackwood finds out you helped us," Silas told the doctor plainly. Dr. Adams looked from Silas's grim face to the pale, sweating face of the young man on his table. He saw the courage and the desperation, and something inside him, a piece of his conscience he thought had long since withered, stirred to life. "Blackwood doesn't own my oath," the doctor said, reaching for his instruments. "Just stand guard at the door." The incident did not go unnoticed. A neighbor saw the late-night activity. Word began to spread, not as a direct accusation, but as a whispered story. People started to see that this was not just a land dispute between ranchers. It was a fight for the very soul of their community. They had all seen Blackwood's cruelty, and now they were seeing the quiet courage of those who dared to oppose him. The social prejudice against Alara began to slowly erode. When she went into town for supplies, the whispers were different. There was less scorn and more a grudging, fearful respect. They saw her strength, her quiet dignity, and they knew she was allied with the cause they were all secretly starting to support. She was no longer just the outlaw's widow. She was a key figure in the resistance. Blackwood was not a fool. Through his network of spies and the increasing paranoia that drove him, he finally began to realize the truth. The disruptions were too coordinated, too close to home. He pieced together the fragments of rumor and observation, and finally understood the extent of the conspiracy. And more importantly, he saw the connection between the quiet, dangerous man named Silas and the resilient widow, Alara. He saw her not as a victim, but as the heart of the rebellion, the anchor that kept Silas in the valley, the reason he was fighting instead of running. He finally understood. To break the man, he must first break the woman. One evening, from a high ridge, Thaddeus Blackwood trained his field glasses on Alara's small, lonely cabin. He watched as a lamp was lit, a single, warm point of light in the vast darkness. He watched until he saw two silhouettes move past the window, one of them belonging to the man who was causing him so much trouble. A cold, predatory smile touched his lips. He had found Silas's weakness. He had found the one thing in the world the man valued more than his own life. The fight was about to become deeply, horribly personal. An atmosphere of dread, thick and cloying as summer humidity, descended upon the valley. The small victories had been a brief, defiant flare of light, but now the darkness was rushing back in, colder and more complete than before. Thaddeus Blackwood, having been stung by gnats, was now preparing the meticulous, crushing response of a grizzly. He knew he could not catch Silas in an open fight. The man was too skilled, too much a ghost of the landscape. So he concocted a plan not to trap the body, but to assassinate the name. He orchestrated the crime with the precision of a master strategist. A payroll wagon, belonging to a distant mining company with no local loyalties, was due to travel through the old Western Pass, a route Silas was known to use when checking the furthest fence lines. Blackwood chose his instrument carefully, one of his most ruthless hired guns, a man named Court, who was of a similar build to Silas and rode a powerful buckskin horse. The raid was swift and brutal. Court and 2 other men ambushed the wagon at a narrow bend in the trail. They took the payroll box, but that was secondary. Following Blackwood's explicit instructions, Court deliberately shot and killed one of the 2 guards, a young man barely out of his teens. As the other guard fled in terror, Court knelt by the body. He pulled from his pocket a small, distinctive knife with a handle of polished deer antler, a knife Silas had been known to carry. He had lost it weeks ago during a skirmish with a coyote, never knowing that one of Blackwood's spies, a disgruntled ranch hand from a neighboring property, had found it and delivered it to the one man who would pay for such a thing. Court plunged the knife into the dusty earth beside the dead guard's hand and rode away. The frame fell into place with terrifying efficiency. The surviving guard made it to Redemption Gulch, babbling a story of a silent, deadly attacker on a buckskin horse. Sheriff Cobb, acting on an immediate, anonymous tip that pointed him toward the Western Pass, formed a posse with a great show of civic duty. They discovered the body and, of course, the knife. Cobb held it up for all to see, its antler handle glinting in the sun. The narrative spread through the town like a plague. Silas, the quiet drifter who had defended the widow, was not a protector after all. He was a cold-blooded killer, a thief who had murdered a man for a box of gold. The story made a grim sort of sense to the wary, hardened people of Redemption Gulch. He was an outsider, a man with no history and a fast gun. It was easier to believe him a villain than a hero. The bounty on his head, posted by the mining company and supplemented by Blackwood's civic-minded contribution, skyrocketed to a sum that would make any man with a gun and an empty stomach consider the odds. The fragile alliance Silas had built with the other ranchers was immediately poisoned. Fear and doubt, the old companions of the oppressed, crept back into their hearts. Caleb and Ben Miller were steadfast, but others, who had been on the fence, retreated into a terrified silence. To be associated with Silas now was not just to risk Blackwood's wrath, but to risk being branded an accomplice to murder, to feel the tightening of a noose around your own neck. Silas was caught completely off guard. He was at Alara's cabin when a frantic, breathless Henry Gable rode up, his old face pale with terror. "Silas, you have to run!" the old farmer gasped, his horse heaving. "The sheriff! He formed a posse. They found the guard from the mining payroll, murdered. They say it was you. They found your knife." The news was a gut punch, knocking the air from his lungs. It was a perfect trap, and he had walked right into it. He was no longer a resistor. He was an outlaw. The law he had once sought to uphold, however corrupt, was now hunting him. "The posse is already sweeping the valley," Henry urged. "They aim to kill, not to capture. You have to go, now!" There was no time for goodbyes, no time for a plan. He gave Alara one last, desperate look, his eyes conveying all the rage, fear, and love he could not put into words. Then he was on his buckskin, riding hard for the one place a posse would have trouble following, the harsh, rocky Badlands to the north. The landscape became his only ally. He pushed his horse through a maze of jagged canyons and shadowy arroyos, the rock formations a chaotic jumble of rust red and bone white. The Badlands were an inhospitable, waterless territory, a place where a man could disappear, but not a place where he could live for long. Hidden in a shallow cave, overlooking a vast, empty expanse. Silas was consumed by a helpless rage. He was trapped, unable to fight back directly. His name and his honor, the very things he had been fighting for, utterly destroyed by a lie. With Silas on the run, Elara was completely exposed. The tentative respect she had earned from the town evaporated overnight. Once again, she was the outcast. But this time it was worse. She was the lover of a murderer. The old prejudices returned with a vengeance, the whispers more cruel, the scornful glances sharper than ever. She was utterly and completely isolated, a lone woman in a valley that now universally despised her. This was when Blackwood made his move. He came to her cabin alone, not with threats of violence, but with the chilling calm of a serpent. He dismounted and stood on her porch, his large frame blocking the light. "A terrible business. This is," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I must admit, I misjudged the man. To think he was capable of such a thing." Elara stood in her doorway, her rifle in her hands, held loosely but ready. "Get off my land, Blackwood." He smiled, a cold, unhurried expression. "I have come with a proposition, Elara, a way to solve all of this, a way to save your man's life." He leaned against a porch post, the picture of casual power. "Sheriff Cobb works for me. The judge works for me. I can make this all go away. I can produce a new witness, another drifter, perhaps, who will confess to the crime. The charges against Silas will be dropped. He will be a free man." Elara stared at him, her heart turning to ice. She knew there was a price. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat. "Two things," he said, his eyes roaming over her, possessive and triumphant. "You will sign the deed to this land over to me. It is, after all, the water I have always wanted. And second, you will agree to be mine. You will come to town, live under my protection, be my companion." He presented it not as a brutal demand, but as her only choice, a simple transaction to save the man she loved. "I am giving you a chance to be his savior," Blackwood said softly, the words a venomous caress. "You have 3 days to decide, but I should warn you, the posse is closing in on him. They are good trackers, and they have orders not to bring him back alive." While Silas hid like a hunted animal in the Badlands, the posse, led by Sheriff Cobb and Blackwood's most ruthless men, did more than search. They began a campaign of terror. They rode to the farms of the Miller brothers, tearing through their house and barn, finding nothing but earning their silence through fear. Their final stop was the farm of Henry Gable. They found the old farmer by his well, his face a mask of defiant resolve. They demanded to know where Silas was hiding. When Henry refused to speak, his lips a thin, tight line, they made an example of him. They did not shoot him. That would have been too quick, too merciful. They threw a rope over the thick branch of an old oak tree in his own yard. They made him stand on his own wagon, and when he still refused to speak, they kicked it out from under him. They left his body hanging there, a brutal, swaying message to all who would dare to defy Thaddeus Blackwood. The news of Henry's murder spread through the valley like a plague, extinguishing the last embers of open resistance. Hope, it seemed, was well and truly lost. Elara learned of Henry's death from Dr. Adams's young son, who brought the news under the cover of darkness. The boy's face was tear-streaked and full of a horror that mirrored her own. She knew then that Blackwood's threat was not idle. She was trapped in an impossible, agonizing dilemma. If she refused his offer, Silas would be hunted down and killed like Henry, dying a wanted man. If she accepted, she would save his life, but she would condemn herself to a living hell and betray every principle they had fought and bled for. Her internal struggle was a silent, tormenting war. For 2 days, she walked her land, the land she and Thomas had dreamed on, the land she and Silas had fought for. She touched the fence he had mended, stood by the pump he had fixed, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She thought of Silas's confession by the creek, the raw, soul-deep guilt he carried for not being able to protect his family. She could not bear the thought of him dying in some rocky canyon, alone, with that same guilt consuming him, believing he had failed to protect her. too. Her love for him, a fierce, protective thing, forced her to consider the ultimate sacrifice. She would not let his story end that way. On the final day, she made her decision. She found the doctor's son, a boy named Sam, who secretly admired Silas as a hero. She gave him a small, folded piece of paper. "Can you get this to him?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. "Can you do it without being seen?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with the gravity of the mission. The message was simple. A few short lines written in a code they had once devised for fun. It read, "I have a plan to clear your name. Stay hidden. Trust me." Then she put on her best dress, pinned up her hair, and rode her wagon into Redemption Gulch. The scene was tense as she walked through the hostile streets. The whispers and stares like a physical assault. She ignored them, her head held high, her expression a mask of cold resolve. She walked directly to the large, two-story building that served as Blackwood's office, a lioness walking into the den. She was shown into his office, a room of dark wood, rich leather, and the smell of cigar smoke and power. Blackwood sat behind a massive desk, a triumphant, possessive smile on his face. "I see you have made a wise decision," he said. "I accept your offer," Alara stated, her voice devoid of all emotion. Her expression was carefully blank, deadened, a shield for the storm of agony within her. Blackwood's smile widened. He had won. "But I have one condition," she added, her voice sharp. "Silas must be given a horse, a good one, and a full day's head start to ride clear of this territory. The posse must be officially, publicly, called off. I will sign the deed to my land, and I will submit to your arrangement only after I have proof that he is safe and on his way." Blackwood considered her, savoring his absolute victory. Her small demand was nothing. It only made his triumph sweeter. He believed he had not just beaten them, he had broken them, turned their love into a tool for their own destruction. "Agreed," he said. "A rider will be sent with the news. By this time tomorrow, he will be a free man, and you will be mine." He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. The deed to her land. Alara picked up the pen he offered. Her hand was perfectly steady as she signed her name, the ink a black scar on the page. But her eyes, if he had cared to look closely, reflected a profound, soul-crushing despair. She had sacrificed her freedom, her future, and her very soul for the man she loved. She was stepping willingly into a darkness far deeper and more terrifying than any lonely night she had ever known. The message came via a stone with a piece of paper tied to it, thrown into his camp from a distant ridge by one of Blackwood's men. The scrawled note was simple. The posse had been recalled. A saddled horse and a pack with supplies were waiting for him at the mouth of Coyote Canyon. He was free to go. Silas stood in the thin morning light of the Badlands, the paper crinkling in his hand. Every instinct, honed by years of survival and a deep-seated mistrust of the world, screamed that it was a trap. Blackwood was not a man who gave gifts. But then Alara's message, delivered by the doctor's boy just a day earlier, echoed in his mind. "Trust me." Torn between the gut-wrenching fear that he was walking into an ambush and the desperate urge to honor her wish, he made his way to the canyon. The horse was there, a fine sorrel, along with saddlebags stocked with jerky, hardtack, and a full canteen. It was all too perfect. He mounted the horse and rode south, making a clear show of a man leaving the territory for good. But once he was out of sight, deep in a series of rolling hills, he doubled back. Using the hidden, twisting game trails he knew so well, he made his way to the high ridges that formed the northern wall of the valley. From there, concealed in a stand of ancient, gnarled junipers, he could look down upon the town of Redemption Gulch. He watched, a man suspended between two worlds, his heart a battleground of doubt and faith. Alara would not simply give up their fight. She would not trade her land and her freedom for his. Something was terribly wrong. He waited until nightfall, then slipped down from the ridge like a shadow. He made his way to the edge of town, to the small house that belonged to Dr. Adams. He sent the signal they had agreed upon, the low, mournful call of a screech owl. A few minutes later, the doctor's young son, Sam, slipped out the back door. "She did it to save you," the boy whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. Silas's blood ran cold. He followed the boy to a secluded spot behind the livery, where the doctor was waiting. The old man's face was grim, his eyes full of a weary disgust. "Blackwood has her," the doctor said, his voice low and urgent. "He framed you for that killing, then gave her a choice, her land and herself, in exchange for your life. She made him call off the posse and give you a head start. She is in a room at the hotel, a prisoner in all but name." The realization hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. It drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping in the cold night air. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Ilara had not saved him so he could run. She had sacrificed her own soul so that he could live. His grief and guilt, the constant companions of his lonely life, were momentarily incinerated by a white-hot, clarifying rage. The ghosts of his past were silent, pushed aside by the monstrous reality of the present. His purpose, which had been forged in the fire of Jed's murder, now became absolute. He was not leaving. He was going back. He was going to save her, and he was going to tear down Blackwood's world stone by stone. He knew he could not do it alone. Before the sun rose, Silas was riding again, this time to the homesteads of the men who had retreated into the shadows after Henry's murder. He found them broken, terrified, and defeated. They were good men who had been cowed by a great evil. He did not appeal to their courage this time. He did not speak of fighting for their land or their rights. He found Caleb and Ben Miller first, their faces hollow with grief for their friend Henry. He looked them in the eye and told them the truth of Ilara's sacrifice. "Blackwood has her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous thing. "She traded herself to save my life. While we have been hiding, she has been walking into the lion's den." He let his words sink in. Then his gaze hardened. Henry Gable died because he would not bend. Jedediah Stone died for the same reason. Now Ilara is offering up her own life. If a lone woman can find the courage to face down that monster, then we, as men, do not have the right to hide in the shadows any longer. He was not asking them to be heroes. He was appealing to their memory of the good men they were, to the honor that had been buried under a mountain of fear. His words, forged in his own anguish and resolve, reignited a spark of defiance in their hearts. Caleb Miller, his young face set in grim lines, was the first to stand. "For Henry," he said, his voice thick. His brother Ben stood beside him. They were in. Silas rode to 2 other ranches, carrying the same story. A man named Peterson, who had once shut the door in his face, now listened, his face ashen. By dawn, Silas had his force. It was small and desperate, just 4 men besides himself. But now they were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for redemption. Ilara, meanwhile, was playing a dangerous game. She lived in a room at the town's only hotel, a gilded cage where Blackwood's men could watch her every move. She feigned compliance, a mask of quiet resignation on her face. She allowed Blackwood to escort her to the hotel's dining room for meals, enduring his possessive talk and the hateful stares of the townsfolk. But behind her deadened eyes, her mind was sharp, her senses alert. She was looking for the one thing that could destroy him, his ledger. She knew from overheard whispers that he kept a detailed record of all his criminal activities, the bribes paid to Sheriff Cobb, the schemes to rustle cattle from his neighbors, the illegal land grabs documented with forged signatures. Finding this book was the only way to expose him legally and permanently. She used her forced proximity to him to observe his habits, noting the way he always locked his office himself at the end of the day, the way his hand sometimes drifted to a particular section of the bookshelf behind his desk. Through Sam, who brought her fresh linens as a pretense, Silas managed to get a message to her, working through the boy. They devised a desperate, two-pronged plan. Blackwood, in his arrogance, was planning a large town gathering in 3 days' time to celebrate his acquisition of the stone and Alara's properties, a public display of his ultimate victory. That would be their moment. Alara would secure the proof, and Silas and the ranchers would create the diversion that would give her the chance to escape. The day of the celebration arrived, and Redemption Gulch was filled with a sense of forced festivity. Blackwood had ordered the saloon to serve free whiskey, and a large bonfire was built in the center of the main street. It was a party thrown by a tyrant, and the town attended with the grim obedience of subjects, not the joy of citizens. As the sun set and the bonfire roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the false front buildings, Alara made her move, excusing herself from Blackwood's suffocating presence. She slipped away, her heart pounding. She used a key she had managed to make a wax impression of days earlier to let herself into his office. At the same time, miles away on the eastern edge of town, Silas and his men were moving on their own target. They descended upon Blackwood's main warehouse, a massive structure filled with a winter's worth of supplies and goods. They worked quickly, dousing the walls with oil from the lamps. Silas lit a torch, and with a final look at his men, he threw it into the building. The warehouse went up with a tremendous roar, the dry wood catching instantly. In town, the cry of fire went up. The attention of the entire gathering turned toward the massive column of orange flame and black smoke rising into the night sky. Sheriff Cobb, his face a mask of panic, gathered most of Blackwood's men. "It is the main warehouse. Come on." They raced off, leaving the party and Thaddeus Blackwood momentarily isolated. In his office, Alara worked frantically. She ran her hands along the bookshelf, finding the hidden latch she had suspected was there. A section of the shelves swung inward, revealing a small, heavy safe. She knew the combination. She had watched him work it from a crack in the door a night before, his movements made careless by whiskey and pride. Her trembling fingers worked the dial. The safe clicked open. Inside, beneath a stack of cash, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She grabbed it and turned to flee. The door flew open. Blackwood stood there, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. He had seen the fire, seen his men leave, and had instantly known he had been played. He lunged for her, his hand grabbing her arm in a brutal grip. "You foolish woman," he snarled, twisting the ledger from her grasp. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" He was about to overpower her, to drag her back into the darkness he had planned for her, when a new voice cut through the room, cold and deadly. "Let her go, Blackwood." Silas stood in the doorway, his face grim in the flickering firelight, his Colt steady in his hand. The final showdown took place not in the office, but in the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch, lit by the hellish orange glow of the distant fire. Blackwood, using Alara as a shield, had backed out into the open. He shoved her away, sending her stumbling to the ground, and drew his own weapon. It was not a classic, heroic duel. It was a desperate, ugly fight for survival. Gunshots exploded in the night, the sound echoing off the silent buildings. It ended not with a clean shot, but in a raw, physical struggle. They came together in a tangle of limbs, two men fueled by righteous fury and pure hate. The fight was brutal and short, ending with Silas's hands closing around Blackwood's throat, silencing the tyrant's rage forever. The corrupt sheriff and Blackwood's remaining men returned to a shocking sight. Their leader lay dead in the dust, and Silas stood over him, battered, bruised, but resolute. The ranchers, Caleb, Ben, and the others, stepped out from the shadows, their rifles ready, standing with him, and Alara, her face streaked with dust but her eyes blazing with triumph, held up the leather-bound ledger for all the stunned townsfolk to see. The reign of terror was over. The ledger exposed the depth of Blackwood's corruption, a meticulous record of greed and cruelty that implicated not just Sheriff Cobb, but other key figures in the town. Justice, true and undeniable, finally came to Redemption Gulch. But it was a somber victory, a peace paid for with the lives of Jedediah Stone and Henry Gable. In the weeks that followed, the town was left to pick up the pieces, to learn how to rebuild itself not under the fist of a tyrant, but as a community of survivors. The story does not end with a wedding or a grand celebration. It ends weeks later, in the quiet light of a new dawn. Silas and Alara stood on the hill where Jed was buried. In the wake of Blackwood's fall, the law had righted the illegal claims, and they now held the deeds to both Jed's ranch and Alara's homestead, legally and rightfully theirs. The land around them was scarred by fire and neglect, just as they were scarred by grief and loss. But Silas was no longer the haunted man running from his past. He had turned and faced it, not by running, but by fighting for a future. And Alara was no longer the lonely outcast. In the town's rebuilding, she had emerged as a respected, strong voice of reason and resilience. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. Their love, forged in tragedy and fire, was not a fairy tale romance. It was something stronger, deeper, and more real, a bond tempered in the harshest of flames. They did not speak of the future in grand, impossible terms. They spoke of the things that mattered, the small, hopeful acts of living. They spoke of rebuilding the barn, of planting a new garden come spring, of the coming winter and the work it would take to be ready for it. As they stood together, watching the sun rise, it cast a warm, golden light over the harsh but beautiful landscape. A sense of hard-won peace settled over them, as quiet and as real as the earth beneath their feet. They had survived. They had each other, and in a world that had done its very best to break them, they had finally found a place to call home. Thank you for listening to this story from the heart of the American West. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.